The heat sat heavy on the valley floor, a physical weight that pressed the breath out of the afternoon and turned the air into a shimmering haze of dust and grit. It was the kind of midsummer heat that silenced even the cicadas, leaving only the rhythmic, dry crunch of wagon wheels and the occasional stamp of a tired horse to mark the passage of time in the town of Oakhaven. Silas moved through the boardwalk shadows with the deliberate, heavy gait of a man who had spent too many years walking on uneven ground, his boots worn and coated in the pale yellow dust of the high plains. He was not a man who sought company, and the town was merely a necessity, a place to trade the few goods his land produced for the staples he could not grow himself. The saloon, a weather-beaten structure with peeling paint and clouded windows, offered the only respite from the sun, though the air inside was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and spilled ale. Silas pushed through the swinging doors, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim interior, his presence commanding a quiet space around him, even as he sought to remain invisible. It was in the corner of the room, far from the bar and the few slumped patrons nursing their midday regrets, that the color caught his eye. A soft, faded pink that had no business existing in this world of browns and grays. She sat on a wooden crate that had been overturned, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together against the sprawling indifference of the room. The dress she wore was an old prairie style, light pink and hemmed with a lace that had long since grayed with dirt, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and stained with the travel dust that coated everything in the territory. She was Chinese, her dark hair pulled back severely, though strands had escaped to cling to her damp forehead. She looked at no one, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, but there was a tremor in her shoulders that betrayed a terror she refused to voice. The bartender, a man with a stained apron and a face hardened by years of transactional cruelty, wiped a rag across the counter and jerked his chin toward the woman when he saw Silas looking. The noise of the saloon seemed to dim, the clinking of glass and the low murmur of conversation fading into the background as Silas stared at the incongruous sight of the woman in the pink dress, abandoned like unwanted freight in the corner of a room that smelled of whiskey and bad intentions. Silas approached the bar, his movements slow, placing a coin on the wood with a sharp click that drew the bartender's eyes back to him. The conversation was low, barely a murmur, but in the stillness of the heat, the words carried a weight that felt heavier than a shout. The bartender leaned in, his voice rasping with a mix of annoyance and indifference, explaining that the woman had been left there 2 days ago by a drifter who had lost his last dollar at the tables and rode out before dawn, leaving her as collateral for a debt that would never be paid. She spoke little English, or perhaps she simply chose not to speak to men who looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture to be bartered or discarded. Silas listened, his face impassive, the lines around his eyes deepening as he looked back toward the corner. She had not moved. She had not asked for water, nor had she begged for mercy. She simply waited, enduring the humiliation of her abandonment with a stoic silence that struck a chord deep within Silas's chest. He knew what it was to be left behind by the world, to be viewed as something separate and apart, though his exile was self-imposed and hers was a cruelty forced upon her. The decision was not made with a flash of heroism or a grand declaration, but rather with the slow, inevitable shifting of a burden from one shoulder to another. Silas turned from the bar, ignoring the drink he had paid for, and walked across the room, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. The other patrons watched, their curiosity piqued, but their lethargy too great to intervene. When he stopped in front of her, the woman flinched, her dark eyes snapping up to meet his, wide with a fear that was sharp and immediate. Silas did not smile. He did not offer soft words or false assurances. He simply looked at her, seeing the exhaustion etched into the delicate features of her face, the way the pink dress hung loosely on her frame, and he nodded once toward the door. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice a low rumble that brokered no argument. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, a sudden reordering of her reality. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the bartender, then back to the tall, grim man standing over her. Seeing no malice in his face, only a weary sort of resolve, she slowly stood, her legs trembling as she smoothed the skirts of the pink dress. She gathered nothing, for she had nothing to gather, and followed him out into the blinding white heat of the afternoon. The journey back to the ranch was defined by the oppressive silence of the summer heat and the rhythmic creaking of the wagon as it rolled over the rutted earth. The sun beat down on the canvas cover of the wagon, but Silas had left the front open, allowing the hot wind to blow through, carrying the scent of dry sage and heated earth. May sat on the far end of the bench seat, putting as much distance between herself and the rancher as the wood allowed, her hands gripping the edge of the seat until her knuckles turned white. She watched the landscape roll by, a vast, unending ocean of brown grass and scrub brush that seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by the distant, shimmering mirage of the horizon. It was a terrifying openness for someone who had known only the crowded noise of mining camps, or the stifling confinement of the saloon, and the sheer scale of the isolation seemed to shrink her, making her feel small and fragile in the pink dress that fluttered in the wind. Silas held the reins loosely, his eyes scanning the trail ahead, his body swaying slightly with the motion of the wagon. He did not speak to her, sensing that words would only deepen her fear. He was a man who had lived in silence for so long that it had become a second skin, comfortable and protective, and he saw no need to fill the air with idle chatter. Yet he was acutely aware of her presence, of the slight weight she added to the wagon, of the way she held her breath whenever the wheels dipped into a rut. He wondered what she was thinking, what horror she had endured to end up abandoned in a saloon in the middle of nowhere. But he knew that those stories would emerge in their own time, if they emerged at all. For now, the only thing that mattered was the road and the destination. The heat was relentless, beads of sweat gathering under the brim of his hat, but he did not stop. To stop was to invite the reality of what he had done to settle in too quickly. He had taken a stranger, a woman from a world he did not understand, and was bringing her to a home that had not heard a woman's voice in nearly a decade. The absurdity of it gnawed at the back of his mind, but beneath it lay a bedrock of certainty. He could not have left her there. That was the beginning and the end of it. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, bruised shadows across the prairie as the wagon finally turned off the main trail and onto the faint, overgrown track that led to his land. The ranch house sat in the crook of a low hill, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a grove of cottonwood trees that had drunk deep from the underground creek. It was a modest structure, built of rough-hewn timber and stone, its edges softened by years of weathering. A porch wrapped around the front, empty save for a single rocking chair and a stack of firewood cured by the summer sun. As the horses slowed, sensing home, Silas glanced at May. Her eyes were wide, taking in the desolation of the place, the utter lack of neighbors or civilization. It was a hard place, a lonely place, and for a moment he felt a pang of guilt for bringing her here, to a life that demanded callous strength just to survive. But when he pulled the horses to a halt and set the brake, the silence that settled over them was not the hostile silence of the town, but the deep, living quiet of the land. The sound of wind in the cottonwoods, the distant call of a hawk, the breathing of the horses. "We're here," he said softly, breaking the spell. May climbed down from the wagon with stiff, uncertain movements, her legs cramping from the long ride. She stood in the dust of the yard, the pink dress stark against the earth tones of the ranch, and looked up at the house. It loomed over her, dark and imposing, a fortress of solitude that seemed to watch her with indifferent eyes. Silas unhitched the horses, his movements efficient and practiced, leaving her a moment to compose herself. He did not rush her. He knew the terror of new thresholds, the the fear of stepping into a space that belonged to another. When he was finished, he walked past her, his boots crunching on the gravel, and opened the heavy front door. He did not hold it open with a flourish, nor did he gesture for her to enter first. He simply left it ajar, a silent invitation, and disappeared into the shadows of the interior. May hesitated, her hand fluttering to her throat, her gaze darting to the open horizon one last time. There was nowhere to run, no town to walk to, nothing but the empty miles of grass. She took a breath, the air hot and dry in her lungs, and stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under her slight weight. She pushed the door further open and stepped inside, crossing the boundary from the blinding light of the summer day into the cool, dim sanctuary of the stranger's home. The interior of the house was cooler than the air outside, though it held a stillness that felt ancient, as if the air itself had not moved in years. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that cut through the gaps in the curtains, illuminating a room that was sparse and utilitarian. A heavy table sat in the center of the main room, surrounded by 2 chairs, one of which looked as though it had not been sat in for a very long time. There were no ornaments, no softness, nothing to suggest comfort or leisure. It was a space built for survival, for eating and sleeping and sheltering from the elements. Silas was already in the kitchen area, pumping water into a tin cup. The sound of the water splashing was loud in the quiet house, a sharp, clear noise that emphasized the lack of other sounds. He turned and held the cup out to her. May stood by the door, afraid to venture further, clutching her arms around herself. She looked at the cup, then at his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not unkind. She stepped forward, the floorboards smooth beneath her worn shoes, and took the cup, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand for the briefest of seconds. She drank quickly, the water cool and sweet, washing away the dust of the road. Silas watched her, noting the way her hands shook, the desperation in her thirst. When she lowered the cup, she looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than fear. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply relief. "There is food," he said, gesturing to a pantry cupboard, "and a place to sleep." He pointed toward a door at the back of the room. "It's small, but it has a lock." The mention of the lock seemed to register with her. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. It was an acknowledgment of her vulnerability, a promise of safety that he was giving her the power to enforce. She nodded, a small, jerky motion. She did not speak, but the tension in the room shifted, the air becoming less charged with potential danger and more heavy with the awkwardness of 2 strangers sharing a space that was too small for their secrets. Silas turned back to the stove, starting the process of making a fire not for warmth, but to cook. The strike of the match, a sharp sound that signaled the end of the journey and the beginning of something else. Night fell slowly in the summer, the light lingering in the sky long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of violet and bruised orange. The ranch house settled into the darkness, the timbers contracting with pops and groans as the temperature dropped. May had retreated to the small room Silas had indicated, closing the door softly behind her. Silas sat at the main table, a plate of beans and cornbread untouched before him, listening to the silence. He was used to the quiet, but tonight it felt different. It felt charged, pregnant with the presence of another human being. He could hear the faint rustle of fabric from behind the closed door, the soft sound of a footstep. She was there, a reality he could not ignore. He ate mechanically, the food tasting of nothing, his mind racing with the practicalities of the situation. He had no supplies for a woman, no understanding of her needs, no language to bridge the gap between them. And yet, when he looked at the closed door, he felt a strange sense of rightness. The house had been too empty for too long. Morning came with a pale white light that washed out the colors of the world. Silas woke before dawn, as was his habit, dressing in the dark and heading out to tend to the stock. When he returned to the house, the sun was just cresting the hills, flooding the kitchen with a harsh, revealing brightness. He expected to find the door to her room still shut, expected her to hide away until forced to emerge. Instead, he found May standing by the stove. She had found a broom and was sweeping the floor, her movements small and efficient. She had tried to clean the dust from her pink dress, though the stains remained, and she had retied her hair, smoothing it back with water. She froze when he entered, the broom held tight in her hands like a shield. Silas stopped in the doorway, the bucket of milk in his hand heavy. They stared at each other for a long moment, the morning light catching the dust in the air between them. He did not tell her to stop. He did not tell her she didn't have to work. He understood the language of labor, the need to earn one's keep, to prove one's worth in a harsh world. He nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of his chin, acknowledging her contribution. She exhaled, a soft sound, and resumed sweeping. It was a small thing, a mundane domestic task, but in the quiet of the morning it felt like a treaty being signed. She was no longer just a piece of abandoned cargo. She was a presence in the house, a force that was beginning, ever so slowly, to reshape the space around her. The weeks that followed bled into one another, marked not by the calendar but by the slow, sun-drenched rhythm of the ranch. The heat of the summer did not break, baking the earth until it was hard as iron, but inside the house a different kind of softening was taking place. May had taken over the domestic sphere with a quiet determination that Silas found both unsettling and deeply comforting. The kitchen, once a place of stark utility where meals were consumed in haste, now smelled of wild sage and roasted root vegetables, scents that greeted Silas like a physical embrace when he returned from the pastures at dusk. She had found an old sewing kit in a forgotten drawer and had begun to mend the tattered edges of her pink dress, her head bent low in the evenings by the light of the oil lamp, her fingers moving with the precision of a spider weaving a web. Silas would sit in his chair, a book lying open and unread on his lap, watching her from beneath the brim of his hat. They spoke little. The barrier of language was still a river between them, wide and treacherous, but they were learning to build bridges with gestures and glances. He would bring in a handful of wildflowers found near the creek bed, bluebells and Indian paintbrush, and leave them on the table without a word. She would not smile, not fully, but her eyes would soften, and later he would find them arranged in a jar of water, a small splash of vibrant life against the rough wood. It was a courtship of silence, a negotiation of space where the currency was not gold or promises, but the simple, consistent act of being present. One evening, the oppressive heat broke not with a cool breeze, but with the violent arrival of a prairie storm. The sky turned a bruised, sickly green in the late afternoon, the air growing heavy and still, charged with a static that made the hair on Silas's arms stand up. He spent the hour before sunset securing the barn doors and checking the horses, the wind whipping his coat around his legs as the first fat drops of rain began to crater the dust. When he finally pushed into the house, the wind howling like a wounded animal around the eaves, he found the interior dark. May was not in the kitchen. He found her in the corner of the main room, pressed into the shadows between the fireplace and the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, her hands clamped over her ears. The thunder was a physical assault here, shaking the very timbers of the house, a deafening roar that sounded like the end of the world. Silas shed his wet coat and crossed the room, his boots heavy on the floor. He did not touch her at first. He simply sat down on the floor nearby, placing his large, solid presence between her and the storm raging outside. "It's just noise," he said, his voice low and rumbling, undercutting the shrieking wind. "The house is strong. It has stood for 40 years. It will stand tonight." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark, reflecting the flash of lightning that illuminated the room in a stark, stuttering white. In that flash, he saw a vulnerability so raw it made his chest ache. Slowly, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, then leaned into the touch, her trembling body seeking the anchor of his strength. They sat there for hours as the storm battered the plains, two castaways on an island of wood and stone, the distance between them shrinking until it was measured only by the warmth of his hand on her arm. The morning after the storm, the world was washed clean, the colors sharp and vivid under a crystalline blue sky. But the pantry was running low, and the necessity of survival forced an intrusion of the outside world. Silas hitched the wagon, the horses stepping high and eager in the cooler air, and waited by the porch. When May emerged, she had made an effort to look presentable, her dress scrubbed and mended, her hair smoothed back with painstaking care. But as she climbed onto the wagon seat, Silas saw the tension return to her jaw, the way her hands gripped her skirts. Going back to town meant facing the eyes that had watched her abandonment with indifference. "You don't have to go," Silas said, looking at the road ahead. "I can load the supplies." May looked at him, then at the horizon. She shook her head once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I go," she said, the words heavily accented but clear. It was a declaration of existence. She would not hide. Silas nodded, a flicker of fierce pride igniting in his gut. He snapped the reins, and they rolled out toward Oakhaven. The town was busy when they arrived, the storm having delayed travel for many, and the muddy streets were churned by wheels and hooves. As they walked along the boardwalk toward the general store, silence rippled outward from them. Men stopped their conversations to stare. Women pulled their children closer. Silas walked on the outside, placing his body between May and the crowd, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip, not as a threat, but as a warning. Inside the store, the shopkeeper, a man Silas had known for years, hesitated when he saw May, his eyes darting to the other customers. "Silas," the man said, his voice tight, "we don't usually serve strangers." Silas didn't blink. He placed his hands flat on the counter, leaning in until he occupied the shopkeeper's entire field of vision. "She is not a stranger," Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She is with me, and my coin is as good as any man's here, unless you're telling me it isn't." The shopkeeper swallowed, the color draining from his face, and hurriedly began to tally the order. May stood beside Silas, her head high, her hand brushing against his sleeve. In that moment, in the hostility of the town, they were no longer just two people sharing a house. They were a united front, bound by the shared defiance of a world that wanted to reject them both. The drive back to the ranch was different. The tension of the town had evaporated, replaced by a strange, heady exhilaration. The sun was setting, casting long, golden rays across the damp earth, making the prairie grass glow as if lit from within. Silas watched May from the corner of his eye. She was no longer shrinking into the seat. She was watching the land, her expression thoughtful, her posture relaxed. When they arrived at the house and unloaded the supplies, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a twilight that was soft and forgiving. Inside, while May put away the flour and coffee, Silas lit the fire, the flames crackling cheerfully in the grate. He turned to watch her, realized that the emptiness that had defined this house for a decade was gone, filled by the quiet rustle of her presence. He walked over to her, stopping just inches away. She turned, looking up at him, and the air between them grew thick and charged. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small length of ribbon he had purchased in town, hidden beneath the sacks of grain. It was a deep, rich red, the color of luck, or so he had heard. He held it out to her. "For your hair," he murmured, feeling foolish and clumsy. May stared at the ribbon, then at his face, her eyes filling with sudden tears. She didn't take the ribbon. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and rough against his calloused palm. She pressed his hand to her cheek, closing her eyes. It was a gesture of such profound intimacy that Silas forgot to breathe. He stepped closer, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. There were no words for what passed between them then, an acknowledgment of broken things fitting together, of a loneliness that had finally found its cure. Summer began to bleed into autumn, the golden light turning sharper, the mornings crisp with the promise of frost. The cottonwoods along the creek began to turn, dropping yellow leaves that drifted like coins onto the dark water. The question of the future hung unspoken in the cooling air. Silas knew that winter on the plains was a brutal test, one that broke even the strongest spirits. He found May one evening, standing on the porch, looking out at the darkening hills, wrapped in a shawl he had given her. He stepped out beside her, the wood of the porch railing rough under his hands. "The snows will come soon," he said, his voice gruff. "The passes will close. If you wish to go, to find your people, I can take you to the train in the city before the weather turns." It was the hardest thing he had ever said, an offer that felt like tearing out his own heart, but he would not keep her as a prisoner of his solitude. May turned to him, the red ribbon woven into her dark hair. She looked at the land, harsh and unforgiving, and then at the man who stood as solid and enduring as the hills themselves. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, lacing their fingers together with a strength that surprised him. "My people," she said softly, gesturing first to the house, then to him. "Here." She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, heavy beat of his heart. Silas wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the warmth of his coat, burying his face in the scent of her hair. The wind blew cold from the north, carrying the scent of coming winter, but for the first time in his life Silas did not fear the cold. He held her tight, the woman in the pink dress who had saved him just as surely as he had saved her, and watched the stars wheel overhead, anchored at last.